Moscow, December 1941. The capital is frozen in anxious anticipation. German troops are only 25 kilometers from the city. Their binoculars can already discern the domes of Moscow churches. Barricades are in the streets. Barrage balloons are in the sky. 5 months of continuous battles, retreats, and losses have brought the country to the brink of an abyss. The Soviet Union lost vast territories, millions of people, thousands of tanks and aircraft. A third of its industry was in enemy hands. The enemy captured Kiev, blockaded Leningrad, and reached the approaches to the capital. Many in the world considered the fall of Moscow inevitable. German officers received parade uniforms for a triumphant march across Red Square. But in these critical days, a plan was already maturing at the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. A plan destined to change the course not only of the Great Patriotic War, but of the entire Second World War. A plan that would prove to the world the invincible Wehrmacht can be stopped and turned back. Plan Barbarossa, developed by the German command, envisioned a lightning-fast defeat of the Soviet Union within 3 to 4 months. Moscow was considered a key target, whose capture was to lead to the complete collapse of the Soviet state. On September 30th, 1941, Operation Typhoon began, a decisive offensive on the Soviet capital. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal von Bock, concentrated colossal forces. 78 divisions, including 14 tank and 8 motorized. 1.5 million soldiers, 1,900 tanks, more than 1,000 aircraft. The German command was confident in its success. Hitler declared, "Moscow will be wiped off the face of the earth." The first days of the offensive brought impressive successes to the Wehrmacht. With powerful blows of tank wedges, the Germans broke through the Soviet defenses. On October 6th, 4 Soviet armies, more than 600,000 men, were encircled in the Vyazma area. 3 more armies found themselves in the cauldron near Bryansk. It seemed that the path to Moscow was open. German tanks moved along deserted roads, meeting only weak resistance from scattered units. On October 14, Kalinin fell. On the 16th, Borovsk. On the 18th, Mozhaisk. German motorcyclists reached Khimki Station, just 18 kilometers from the Kremlin. Panic began in Moscow. On October 16, there was a mass exodus of residents and institutions. Factories, government agencies, diplomatic missions were evacuated. Documents were burned in the streets, shops were looted. The city was preparing for street fighting. Barricades were erected at intersections. Firing points were equipped in houses. The Wehrmacht was so confident in the imminent fall of Moscow that German newspapers published maps of the city with marked attractions that the victors were supposed to visit. Officers received guidebooks to the Soviet capital. A plan for its destruction was created in advance. Moscow was supposed to be flooded, turning it into a huge reservoir. When, in October 1941, German troops approached Moscow, the capital transformed into a fortress city. 3 defensive lines were constructed around it. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites, mostly women, teenagers, and elderly people, worked day and night digging anti-tank ditches, building pillboxes and bunkers, and installing anti-tank obstacles. In a matter of weeks, over 800 kilometers of trenches were built, almost 25,000 firing positions were established, and about 60,000 anti-tank barriers were erected. The Mozhaisk defense line became the first serious barrier in the path of German troops. Here, cadets from military schools and Podolsk cadets, whose names are forever etched in the history of the war, stood to the death. Barely trained, very young, they held back the Wehrmacht's tank divisions, gaining precious days. On the Borodino field, where the Russian army once fought Napoleon, Colonel Polosukin's 32nd Rifle Division now stood to the death. The heroic defense of Tula became another key element in the capital's protection. When Guderian's German tanks broke through to this city of arms makers, Not only regular units but also workers' detachments, sometimes armed only with rifles and Molotov cocktails, rose in defense. The city transformed into an impregnable fortress, against which all attacks by Wehrmacht tank divisions were shattered. NKVD units played a special role in the defense of Moscow. They guarded vital objects, fought saboteurs and spies, and formed extermination battalions. Soldiers of the separate motorized rifle brigade of Special Purpose NKVD became the core of the defense in the most dangerous sectors, conducting daring raids into the enemy's rear. At the most critical moment, on October 10, 1941, Army General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was appointed commander of the Western Front. His name was already known after the victory over the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, but it was near Moscow that his talent as a commander fully unfolded. Zhukov acted harshly, sometimes mercilessly, but such a commander was precisely what was needed in those days. He personally visited the most dangerous sectors of the front, transferred the last reserves to where a breakthrough was imminent, and demanded a stand to the death. Under his leadership, scattered units united into a single front, capable not only of defending but also of preparing for a decisive counterblow. On November 15, 1941, the Wehrmacht undertook a final desperate attempt to capture Moscow. The German command threw all available reserves into battle. Guderian's and Hübner's tank groups struck from the north and south, aiming to encircle the capital in steel pincers. On the Volokolamsk highway, German tanks broke through the defenses and rushed towards the town of Yakroma, creating a threat of outflanking Moscow from the north. In those days, the distance between the advanced units of the Wehrmacht and the Kremlin narrowed to 25 kilometers. German officers could discern Moscow's high-rises through their binoculars. On the Volokolamsk direction, General Panfilov's division fought heroically. It was here, at Dubosekovo Junction, that 28 soldiers engaged in an unequal battle with German tanks. Political instructor Klochkov uttered the legendary words, "Russia is vast, but there's nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us." The Panfilov men destroyed 18 enemy vehicles, but almost all perished in this battle. In the Istra area, the 37th Rifle Brigade waged fierce battles. Its soldiers, retreating under the onslaught of superior enemy forces, blew up the dam of the Istra Reservoir. The surging water created an insurmountable obstacle for German tanks, forcing them to seek detours and lose precious time. On the southern flank, near Tula, an equally dramatic battle unfolded. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army attempted to bypass the city from the east and reach Moscow from the south. Here, General Bolden's 50th Army and units of the People's Militia stood to the death. Workers of Tula factories produced weapons by day and went into battle with them by night. The city of arms makers became an impregnable fortress. By the end of November, the German offensive began to lose momentum. The first severe frosts struck, reaching 30 degrees below zero. The Germans lacked winter uniforms, fuel froze in their tanks, and engines failed. The Wehrmacht divisions, exhausted by months of fighting, were bled white. Losses reached 50% of personnel. German soldiers in summer greatcoats, wrapping their feet in straw and rags, struggled to move across the snow-covered fields. By the end of November 1941, the German offensive on Moscow had completely run out of steam. The Wehrmacht, which only recently seemed invincible, was frozen in the snows of the Moscow region. A strategic pause had set in, a brief but decisive period in the battle for the Soviet capital. During these days, as the front line stabilized, intense work was underway at the Stavka of the Supreme High Command to prepare a counterstrike. Soviet intelligence played a key role in determining the moment for the offensive. Agent reports, prisoner testimonies, aerial reconnaissance, all pointed to the exhaustion of German forces. The Wehrmacht was in a critical state. Units had suffered enormous losses, equipment was failing due to frost, supplies were disrupted, and reserves were absent. Particularly valuable information came from the agent Red Orchestra, who reported that the German command had switched to defense and did not plan new offensive operations in the near future. Under these circumstances, Stalin convened a military council in the Kremlin on November 29th. Zhukov, Shaposhnikov, Vasilevsky, and Konev were present. The question discussed was, should they continue the defense or launch a counteroffensive? Opinions were divided. Some generals believed they should wait until spring to accumulate more forces, but Zhukov insisted on an immediate counterstrike. He argued, the enemy is exhausted, lacks equipped winter positions, suffers from the cold, and every day of delay will allow him to strengthen. Stalin, having heard all sides, made a historic decision: to begin the counteroffensive in early December. The Germans are panicking from our frosts. They are poorly dressed, he said. Now is the time to go on the offensive. On the same day, directives were issued to the fronts regarding the preparation of offensive operations. The covert redeployment of reserves to the front line began. Echelons with troops moved only at night, and strict camouflage was observed. Unit commanders were informed of the upcoming offensive only a few hours before its start. German intelligence was unable to uncover the large-scale preparation of Soviet troops for the counterstrike. Special attention was paid to keeping secret the arrival of fresh Siberian and Far Eastern divisions. These units, hardened in a harsh climate and perfectly prepared for winter warfare, were to become the main strike force of the counteroffensive. They were transferred from the Far East thanks to information from Soviet intelligence officer Richard Sorge that Japan would not attack the USSR in the near future. By early December 1941, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command had concentrated a powerful fist of fresh reserves near Moscow. Siberian and Far Eastern divisions played a key role in this. Fighters hardened in a harsh climate, for whom Moscow's frosts were a familiar matter. These units became a real surprise for the German command, which believed that all Soviet reserves had already been exhausted. The decision to transfer troops from the Far East was made possible thanks to a report from the legendary intelligence officer Richard Sorge from Tokyo. He reported that Japan did not plan to attack the Soviet Union, having concentrated its forces on expansion in the southern direction. This allowed 10 rifle and 4 tank divisions, as well as 9 rifle brigades, about 100,000 well-trained fighters, to be withdrawn from the Far Eastern borders. Siberian divisions were distinguished not only by their endurance, but also by excellent equipment for winter conditions. The soldiers had warm uniforms, sheepskin coats, felt boots, fur mittens, and white camouflage robes. Unlike the Germans, who suffered from the cold, Siberians felt at home in the snow. Many of them were excellent skiers, which allowed them to make rapid maneuvers through deep snow, bypassing German positions. The First Shock Army under the command of General Vasily Kuznetsov played a special role in planning the counterattack. Formed in November 1941, it consisted of fresh Siberian units and was intended to deliver the main blow on the right flank of the Western Front. The army received reinforced artillery and tank units. No less important was the role of General Leonid Govorov's army, concentrated in the Solnechnogorsk direction. Govorov, a talented artilleryman, skillfully organized massive fire support for the advancing units. Under his command were the 5th, 16th, and 33rd Armies, replenished with fresh Siberian formations. The combat qualities of the Far Eastern divisions were highly valued by the Soviet command. These units underwent serious training. Many had combat experience against the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol. They were distinguished by iron discipline, resilience, and the ability to fight autonomously. German soldiers soon learned with horror what a Siberian attack in 30-degree frost was like. The development of the counteroffensive plan near Moscow became the pinnacle of Soviet military thought in 1941. In the quiet of staff offices, over maps with front lines marked, an operation was born that was destined to change the course of the war. The main architects of this plan were Army General Georgy Zhukov and Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov, two outstanding strategists with different approaches to military art. Zhukov, with his decisive character and intuition, insisted on deep flanking strikes capable of cutting off the most advanced German units. Shaposhnikov, a brilliant theoretician, methodically calculated all possibilities, assessed risks, and determined the necessary forces. Their creative union gave birth to a plan that combined boldness and calculation. The main idea of the counteroffensive was simple and brilliant: to deliver powerful blows to the flanks of the German grouping, where the enemy's defense was most vulnerable. The northern strike was planned by the forces of the Kalinin front, from the area of Kalinin towards Klin and Solnechnogorsk. The southern one, by the troops of the left wing of the Western Front and the right wing of the Southwestern Front towards Uzlovaya and Bogoroditsk, with a subsequent encirclement of Tula. In the center, the troops were to tie down the enemy, preventing him from transferring reserves. Zhukov and Shaposhnikov understood. Resources were limited. Every tank, every gun counted. Therefore, the distribution of forces became a true art. On the directions of the main attacks, strike groups were created with a density of up to 120 guns per kilometer of front. With an overall force ratio close to equal, a twofold, and in some places even threefold superiority was achieved in decisive sectors. Special attention was paid to artillery, the god of war. Zhukov, himself a former artilleryman, demanded the creation of powerful artillery support groups for the infantry. Guns were advanced for direct fire to hit enemy pillboxes and dugouts. Katyusha rocket launchers were planned to be used to create a barrage of fire in front of advancing units. Tank formations, which were catastrophically scarce, were distributed among infantry units in small groups of 10 to 15 vehicles. They were to be the spearhead of the attack, breaking through the German defenses. The few tank brigades were consolidated into mobile groups to develop success and pursue the retreating enemy. Camouflage became another key element of the plan. The appearance of continued defense was created. During the day, units remained stationary. Movements and regroupings were carried out only at night. False radio communications and demonstrative engineering works in secondary directions were intended to disorient the enemy. The winter of '41 went down in history as one of the key factors in the Battle of Moscow. When the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, nature seemed to stand up in defense of the Soviet capital. These anomalous cold spells became a real test for both armies, but their impact turned out to be fundamentally different for the warring sides. The German army, which planned to complete the campaign before the onset of cold weather, was completely unprepared for the Russian winter. The Wehrmacht's Supreme Command, confident of a quick victory, did not bother with winter uniforms. Soldiers met the frosts in summer greatcoats, leather boots, and side caps. They wrapped their feet in newspapers, huddled in stolen blankets and women's scarves. But this did not save them from frostbite. Thousands of German soldiers suffered severe frostbite of their limbs. Many became disabled. German equipment proved to be just as vulnerable to the frosts. Engines refused to start, fuel froze in tanks, and metal became brittle. Artillery pieces went out of order due to freezing lubricant. Tanks and trucks turned into useless piles of metal. German tank crews were forced to keep their engines running all night so that the vehicles could move in the morning. Fuel consumption increased several times, which created additional supply problems. Soviet troops, although they experienced difficulties with winter uniforms after losing warehouses in the summer-autumn battles, were still better prepared for the cold. The Red Army had experience in conducting military operations in winter conditions, honed during the Finnish campaign. Soldiers knew how to equip dugouts, how to protect themselves from frostbite, how to camouflage themselves in the snow. Siberian divisions, for whom frosts were a common occurrence, particularly stood out. the Soviet command skillfully used winter conditions for tactical purposes. Ski battalions were widely used, capable of moving silently and quickly through deep snow, bypassing German positions. Red Army soldiers in white camouflage suits were practically invisible in the snow, which allowed them to approach enemy positions unnoticed. Special ski detachments penetrated deep into the enemy's rear, disrupting communications, setting up ambushes on roads and sowing panic. T-34 tanks, with their wide tracks and reliable diesel engines, maintained mobility even in severe frosts and deep snow. Unlike German vehicles, Soviet tanks rarely got stuck in snowdrifts. This gave the Red Army an important advantage in maneuverability. On December 5, 1941, in the snow-covered fields of the Moscow region, an operation began that was destined to change the course of world history. At 5 o'clock in the morning, when the pre-dawn gloom still enveloped the positions, the artillery of the Kalinin front opened hurricane fire on German fortifications. 2 hours later, the troops of the left wing of the Western Front went on the offensive, and on December 6th, the main forces of the Western and right wing of the Southwestern fronts struck. The Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow began, the first strategic offensive operation of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War. For the German command, these strikes came as a complete surprise. General Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, later recalled, "The Russian offensive struck us like a bolt from the blue. We believed that the enemy was incapable of any active operations." Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, was so stunned that he requested permission for an immediate withdrawal of troops. But Hitler categorically forbade any retreat, demanding to stand to the last man. On the Kalinin direction, units of the 29th and 31st Armies broke through the German defenses and rapidly advanced towards the city of Klin. Siberian rifle divisions, attacking in white camouflage suits, struck terror into the enemy. German soldiers called them white ghosts. They suddenly appeared from the snow shroud, attacked, and disappeared, leaving behind destroyed strongholds. Particularly impressive was the strike of General Kuznetsov's 1st Shock Army in the Yakroma area. Overcoming deep snow and severe frost, Soviet units broke through the defenses and advanced 25 kilometers in 2 days. German troops who had no prepared defensive lines in the rear retreated in panic, abandoning equipment and weapons. The 59th Army Corps of the Wehrmacht was under threat of complete encirclement. On the Tula direction, General Golikov's 10th Army dealt a powerful blow to Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army. German tanks, many of which could not move due to frozen fuel and oil, became easy prey for Soviet artillerymen. The advancing units liberated Venev, creating a threat of encirclement for the entire Tula grouping of the enemy. Guderian, contrary to Hitler's order, began to withdraw troops, for which he was subsequently relieved of his post. The psychological effect of the Soviet counteroffensive was enormous. The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht collapsed overnight. German soldiers, who until recently dreamed of a parade on Red Square, now thought only of how to survive in the Russian snows. In diaries and letters of prisoners, words about the Russian miracle and inevitable defeat appeared more and more often. The fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht was undermined. December 6, 1941, became a day of historical turning point. The initial successes of the counteroffensive near Moscow inspired not only the Soviet command, but also all defenders of the capital. Each liberated settlement became a symbol that the hitherto invincible enemy had begun to retreat. The liberation of the city of Yakroma was particularly significant, an important defense hub on the Moscow-Volga Canal. Fighters of the 1st Shock Army, in a swift operation, drove the Germans out of the city, capturing significant trophies: artillery pieces, automobiles, and even serviceable tanks. The enemy fled so hastily that they did not have time to blow up bridges or destroy infrastructure. No less important a victory was the liberation of Kryukovo Station, the last major node of German resistance on the path to Moscow from the northwest. Here, units of the 16th Army under the command of Konstantin Rokossovsky distinguished themselves. The battles for Kryukovo lasted 3 days. The settlement changed hands several times. The Germans turned every house into a strong point, but nothing could stop the Soviet soldiers. On December 7th, the red banner was raised over Kryukovo. Soviet commanders employed various tactical methods to break through enemy defenses. One of the most effective was the use of assault groups. These small but well-armed detachments consisted of riflemen, sappers, and flamethrower operators. They infiltrated the enemy's rear, blocked individual strongpoints, and destroyed them, creating breaches in the defenses that were then widened by the main forces. Artillery played a crucial role in supporting the advancing units. Despite difficult weather conditions, Soviet artillerymen ensured precise targeting. Katyusha rocket launchers were particularly effective. Their salvos literally swept away enemy fortifications and caused panic among German soldiers, who were unprepared for such firepower. On December 8th, the city of Istra was liberated, another key point in the German defense. As they retreated, the Nazis blew up the New Jerusalem Monastery, a unique monument of 17th-century Russian architecture. This act of vandalism only intensified the fury of the Soviet soldiers pursuing the retreating enemy. The counteroffensive near Moscow demonstrated not only the strategic genius of the Soviet command, but also the tactical innovations developed by the Red Army for warfare in harsh winter conditions. These pioneering methods came as an unpleasant surprise to German troops, accustomed to their tactical superiority. Ski battalions became a real nightmare for the Wehrmacht. Formed from experienced Siberian and Ural skiers, these units could cover up to 40 kilometers a day through deep snow. Silently gliding on skis, clad in white camouflage cloaks, they appeared like ghosts in the enemy's rear. Deep flanking maneuvers around German strongholds were particularly effective, with skiers cutting communications, ambushing supply routes, and suddenly attacking headquarters. In the Volokholamsk area, a ski detachment led by Lieutenant Nikolai Gusev penetrated 20 kilometers behind enemy lines and held an important road for 3 days, destroying 17 vehicles carrying ammunition and provisions. The German command was forced to withdraw an entire battalion from the front to combat this detachment. Night operations became another trump card for Soviet troops. While the Germans had an advantage in night combat tactics during the summer, the situation changed dramatically in winter. The Red Army mastered the complex art of night attacks in snow-covered terrain. Specially trained assault groups advanced towards enemy positions under the cover of darkness, using the snow as a natural sound dampener. Sudden night attacks caused panic among German soldiers, exhausted by the cold and constant tension. Special attention was paid to camouflage. Soviet soldiers masterfully used white camouflage suits, snow trenches, and shelters. Snipers, digging into the snow and leaving only a small opening for the rifle barrel, could wait for hours for a target, remaining absolutely invisible. German soldiers in their dark greatcoats became excellent targets against the white background. T-34 tanks demonstrated their clear superiority over German armored vehicles in winter conditions. Their wide tracks ensured low ground pressure, allowing them to maneuver confidently through deep snow and overcome snow-covered ravines. Diesel engines started more easily in the frost compared to the gasoline engines of German panzers of the 3rd and 4th models. December 41st. January 42nd became a time of triumph for Soviet arms. The liberation of towns near Moscow turned from a dream into reality as troops of the Western and Kalinin fronts methodically dislodged the Germans from occupied territories. Each returned settlement became a symbol of the inevitable defeat of the hitherto invincible Wehrmacht. The first major success was the liberation of Klin on December 11th. The city, which the Germans had turned into a powerful strongpoint, fell after fierce fighting. The 30th Army of the Kalinin Front, under the command of General Lelyushenko, particularly distinguished itself here. Tankers and infantrymen stormed the city from several directions, preventing the enemy from consolidating their positions. In Klin, Soviet troops captured huge trophies, including serviceable tanks and artillery pieces. The Germans fled so rapidly that they did not have time to destroy Tchaikovsky's historic house museum. Volokolamsk, heroically defended by the Panfilovtsi in October-November, was liberated on December 20th by units of the 16th Army of General Rokossovsky. The city was in ruins. Retreating, the Nazis blew up buildings and set houses on fire. But this only intensified the fury of the Soviet soldiers who pursued the enemy closely. Rokossovsky skillfully organized the interaction of infantry, tanks, and artillery, giving the enemy no respite, even at night. Narofulminsk, where bloody battles had raged in November, was liberated on December 26th. The 33rd Army of General Efremov distinguished itself here. The Germans had turned every stone house into a strongpoint, mining the approaches to the city. But Siberian rifle divisions, supported by tanks and assault aircraft, drove the enemy out of the city. The liberation of Narofulminsk opened the way to Borovsk and Maloyaroslavets. Especially important was the liberation of Kaluga on December 30th. This large city was the most important German stronghold on the southern flank. The operation was led by General Ivan Konev, commander of the Kalinin Front. He used an original maneuver. The main blow was delivered not head-on, but by bypassing the city from the north and south. Tank and cavalry units penetrated deep into the enemy's rear, cutting off their retreat routes. As a result, the Kaluga garrison of the Wehrmacht found itself semi-encircled and was forced to hastily retreat, abandoning heavy weapons. In response to the successful offensive of Soviet troops, Hitler issued the order, "Hold to the last," on December 18th. The Führer forbade any retreat, demanding that soldiers stand to the death on their occupied lines. "Not one step back," the order read. Commanders who withdrew troops without Hitler's personal permission were subject to court-martial. This order put German generals in an impossible position: to carry out a senseless order and lose troops, or to save soldiers at the cost of their careers and, possibly, their lives. January and February of 1942 became a period of an ambitious attempt by the Soviet command to develop the success of the counteroffensive near Moscow into a full-scale strategic offensive. The Rzhev-Vyazma operation was conceived as a decisive blow, capable of encircling and destroying the main forces of Army Group Center. However, between the conception and its implementation lay a vast distance filled with heroism, tragedies, and the cruel lessons of war. Inspired by the December successes, the Supreme High Command decided to conduct a deep encirclement operation. The plan was truly grandiose. For the forces of the Kalinin and Western fronts to break through the enemy's defenses northwest and southeast of Rzhev, link up in the Vyazma area, and cut off the main forces of the German 4th and 9th Armies. The encirclement ring was to close 200 kilometers west of Moscow. The operation began on January 8th with a strike by the troops of the Kalinin Front, and 2 days later, the Western Front also went on the offensive. Initially, everything developed successfully. Soviet troops broke through the enemy's defenses in several sectors, advancing 40 to 50 kilometers. General Sokolov's 11th Cavalry Corps particularly distinguished itself, deeply penetrating the German rear and cutting important communications. However, the offensive soon began to lose momentum. The fatigue of the troops, who had been fighting continuously for over a month, was taking its toll. Reserves were exhausted, and ammunition was running low. Supplying the advancing units became increasingly problematic. Destroyed roads, deep snow, and impassable terrain made the delivery of food and ammunition an extremely difficult task. The German command, having recovered from the December shock, acted decisively and skillfully. Field Marshal Kluge, who had replaced von Bock as commander of Army Group Center, transferred reserves to threatened areas, organizing counterattacks on the flanks of the advancing Soviet units. The Germans turned every village into a strongpoint, every height into an impregnable fortress. By the end of January, it became clear that the original plan of the operation would not be realized. Soviet troops, who had broken through into the German rear, found themselves semi-encircled. A particularly difficult situation developed for General Efremov's 33rd Army and Belov's cavalry group, operating in the Vyazma area. Cut off from the main forces, suffering from an acute shortage of everything necessary, these formations continued to fight heroically in the German rear. The victory near Moscow in the winter of 1941 became a turning point, not only in the Great Patriotic War, but in the entire Second World War. Its strategic significance is difficult to overestimate. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Wehrmacht suffered a serious defeat, was pushed back from the capital by 100 to 250 kilometers, and lost its strategic initiative. The plan for a lightning war, on which the entire military doctrine of the Third Reich was built, suffered a final collapse. The counteroffensive of Soviet troops led to the liberation of the Moscow, Tula, and parts of the Kalinin and Smolensk regions, an area totaling about 40,000 square kilometers. More than 11,000 settlements were liberated. German troops were pushed back to the lines from which they began Operation Typhoon in September 1941. Wehrmacht losses in the Battle of Moscow proved catastrophic. Army Group Center lost more than 160,000 killed and wounded, about 1,200 tanks, and more than 500 artillery pieces. More than 10 divisions were completely routed. Hitler carried out a large-scale purge of the command staff, dismissing more than 30 senior officers, including Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, and General Guderian, commander of the tank group. Soviet troops also suffered heavy losses, but these were justified by the strategic result achieved. The Red Army proved that it was capable not only of defending, but also of successfully attacking. Invaluable combat experience was gained, which was subsequently used in planning other offensive operations. The victory near Moscow fundamentally changed the international position of the Soviet Union. If in the summer of 1941, many neutral countries doubted the USSR's ability to stand firm, then, after the defeat of the Germans near Moscow, the situation changed. Turkey and Japan abandoned plans to enter the war against the Soviet Union. The USSR's authority among its allies in the anti-Hitler coalition strengthened. Great Britain and the USA became convinced that the Soviet Union was a reliable ally capable of inflicting serious defeats on the Wehrmacht. This accelerated the resolution of issues regarding Lend-Lease supplies and the opening of a second front. On January 1, 1942, the Declaration by United Nations was signed in Washington, a document that laid the foundation for the future UN. The psychological significance of the victory near Moscow was enormous. It dispelled the myth of the invincibility of the German army and instilled in the Soviet people confidence in the ultimate victory. If before this many doubted the possibility of stopping the Wehrmacht, now there was a firm belief in victory. The morale of the army and the people significantly strengthened. The Battle of Moscow went down in history not just as the first major victory of the Red Army, but as a fundamental turning point in the psychology of war. December of 41 changed everything. The world saw that the invincible Wehrmacht could be defeated. For the Soviet people, this victory became a source of inexhaustible faith in their own strength, in their ability to overcome an enemy considered an unsurpassed war machine. The most important lesson of the counteroffensive was the understanding. Victory goes not to him who starts stronger, but to him who knows how to endure at a critical moment and await his hour. Soviet command learned patience, the art of accumulating forces, waiting for the enemy to exhaust his offensive potential. and only then delivering the decisive blow. This strategic principle subsequently formed the basis of all major operations of the Red Army, from Stalingrad to Berlin. The counteroffensive near Moscow was the first experience of conducting a large-scale offensive operation in winter conditions. The Red Army turned the harsh Russian climate into its ally, learned to fight in 30-degree frost, to use snow and ice as natural advantages. Ski battalions, night attacks in white camouflage suits, special techniques for using equipment in winter conditions. All these tactical innovations were born in the snows of the Moscow region. Another important lesson was the significance of fresh reserves. The Siberian and Far Eastern divisions, thrown into battle at the decisive moment, showed that even a small numerical superiority in key directions could radically change the course of the battle. The ability to create and secretly bring up reserves became one of the main principles of Soviet military art. For Soviet commanders, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, the Moscow victory was their first experience of planning and conducting a strategic offensive. They learned from their own mistakes, paid a high price for them, but gained invaluable experience that later helped them win the war. Zhukov later admitted that it was near Moscow that he truly realized how to fight the Germans, to strike them on the flanks, encircle them, and not let them dig in. For the Soviet leadership and Stalin personally, the victory near Moscow confirmed the correctness of the chosen strategy: to mobilize all the country's resources, evacuate industry, and reorient the economy to a war footing. It became clear that the war would be long, but victory was possible. The Moscow counteroffensive laid the foundation for future victories and forever changed the course of 20th century history.